If you enjoy these bone-chilling stories, please give this video a like. It helps more people discover the tales I love to share. And if you want to hear more haunted stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new video. Also, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments what country you're in and what time it is where you are right now. I'd love to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's dive into tonight's chilling story. I never thought much about taking the graveyard shift at the auto shop. It wasn't glamorous, but the overtime pay was good, and out in the middle of nowhere, calls were rare. Plus, how hard could it be? Drive out to a broken car, fix it up, and head back. Simple. That night, the rain came down in sheets, tapping an erratic rhythm on the roof of the garage. It was almost midnight, and I'd been nursing a cold cup of coffee for the last hour, waiting for the shift to end when the radio crackled to life. Truck broke down, 10 miles north on Old Mill Road. Driver can't get it started. Old Mill Road was in the middle of nowhere, a stretch of highway that led out to an abandoned industrial site, long forgotten by anyone with a reason to care. I grabbed my gear, threw on my raincoat, and headed out. The rain was relentless. My wipers were barely keeping up, and visibility was a joke. The deeper I drove into the woods, the darker it got. No streetlights. No passing cars, just the sound of rain and the occasional crack of thunder. My headlights flickered, but I brushed it off as just the storm playing tricks on me. After about 20 minutes, I saw it, a beat-up old truck sitting on the side of the road, headlights off, steam rising from the hood. There was no one in sight. I parked behind the truck and got out, calling into the night, "Hey, you called for a mechanic?" My voice sounded small against the rain, swallowed by the thick, oppressive silence. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the truck. The door was open, but the cab was empty. The seat was wet, like someone had just left. My stomach knotted as I scanned the area with my light. There were no houses around here, no buildings for miles. Maybe they went for help, but in this weather? I turned my attention to the truck, popping the hood. As I began to inspect the engine, I heard it. A faint shuffle from behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the trees. But there was nothing. Just the rain dripping from the branches. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't shake. I worked quickly, but my hands felt heavy, clumsy. The storm wasn't helping. Just as I was finishing up, there was another sound. This time, closer. Footsteps, squelching in the mud, slow, deliberate. I turned around, and in the dim light of the truck's dashboard, I saw someone standing just at the edge of the road, half hidden by the rain. A figure, tall, motionless. "Hey," I called out, but they didn't respond. Just stood there, watching. "Do you need help?" I shouted over the rain, my voice shaking a bit. The figure didn't move. Something in my gut told me to leave. Now I slammed the hood shut and threw my tools into the back of my truck, not even bothering to pack them up. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I glanced back one last time. The figure was gone. I locked the doors, started the engine, and peeled out of there as fast as I could. The headlights cut through the rain as I sped back toward civilization, heart pounding. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight. I didn't stop until I reached the garage. When I pulled in, drenched and shaking, I sat there for a minute, trying to catch my breath, listening to the sound of the rain tapping on the roof, just like before. I never took a night shift after that. I don't know what I saw or who or what was out there in the rain. But every time I drive past Old Mill Road, I can feel it, watching, waiting. It was a rainy night, and I found myself alone on a job that I would have normally passed up, but the pay was too good to ignore. The client wanted me to fix up an old, crumbling house deep in the woods, far from any sign of civilization. I remember driving for hours, the dirt roads turning to mud as the storm raged on. The wind howled through the trees and the rain pounded relentlessly on my truck's windshield. By the time I arrived, the sun had long since set, and all that greeted me was the silhouette of the decaying house standing against the dark sky. The house itself was massive, with creaking wooden boards and a sagging roof. It had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. The client mentioned something about it being an old family estate, passed down through generations, but I didn't ask too many questions. My job was to repair the support beams and floors that were rotting away. Simple enough, I thought. The first few hours were uneventful, just me, my tools, and the constant drumming of rain on the roof. The air inside the house felt heavy, damp with the scent of old wood and mildew. As I worked, the beams groaned and shifted under my weight. But that wasn't surprising for a house this old. What did catch my attention, though, was the sound of footsteps. I was in the living room replacing a few warped floorboards when I heard it. Faint at first, like someone walking slowly upstairs. I froze, my hammer suspended in midair. For a minute, I thought it might have been my imagination, just the wind or the house settling, but the sound was too distinct. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving above me, across the floor of the room directly overhead. I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" Of course, no answer. Brushing it off, I figured an animal had gotten inside, maybe a raccoon or something. Still, I grabbed my flashlight and went upstairs to check. The hallway stretched out before me, long and narrow, with doors on either side, most of them cracked open just enough to make you wonder what might be inside. The beam of my flashlight swept over the floor, revealing thick layers of dust. No footprints, no signs of anything, human or otherwise. I returned downstairs, a little more on edge but determined to finish the job. But then it started again. The same slow, dragging footsteps, only this time they were coming from the basement. I hadn't even gone down there yet, but now I had no choice. Grabbing a crowbar and my flashlight, I made my way to the basement door. The door itself looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Rust covered the hinges, and it took some force to pry it open. A wave of cold, musty air hit me as I descended the creaky wooden steps. My flashlight flickered as I reached the bottom, casting erratic shadows across the damp, unfinished walls. The basement was huge, almost maze-like, with narrow corridors that led deeper into the house's foundation. I searched every corner, every shadowy crevice, but there was nothing. Just more dust, cobwebs, and silence. The footsteps had stopped again, and for a second, I wondered if I was losing my mind. But as I turned to leave, I heard something behind me, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It wasn't a word, just a sound, but it sent a chill down my spine. My flashlight flickered again and then went out completely, plunging me into total darkness. The air felt different now, thicker, colder. I could feel it, something was there, watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as the whisper grew louder, more insistent, like it was right beside me. I stumbled back, my hands fumbling for my phone to use its light. When I finally got it on, I shone it around the room, but there was nothing. I bolted up the stairs and slammed the basement door behind me, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't finish the job that night. I left my tools behind and ran out into the rain, jumped in my truck, and never looked back. The next day I called the client and told them I wouldn't be able to complete the work. They didn't seem surprised. The house is still out there, rotting away in the woods, waiting for the next poor soul who thinks they can fix it. But I'll never go back. Whatever was down there, it wasn't something I was equipped to deal with. It was my first night working the security shift at the old industrial complex just outside of town. The place had been abandoned for years, and now they needed someone to watch over the property after a few recent break-ins. The pay was decent, and I figured it'd be an easy gig. Just me, some old buildings, and maybe a couple of stray animals. How hard could it be? That night, the rain came down in sheets, hammering against the rusted metal roofs of the sprawling complex. I sat in the tiny security office near the entrance, sipping on coffee and watching the surveillance monitors. The old cameras, grainy and glitchy, covered most of the property, showing nothing but endless rows of decaying warehouses, cracked pavement, and overgrown weeds. The sound of the rain against the windows was the only noise in the otherwise dead silence of the place. It was just past midnight when I noticed something strange. One of the cameras, the one covering the north end of the complex where the oldest building stood, began to flicker. The image cut in and out, showing brief flashes of the dilapidated structure. It wasn't unusual for the equipment to act up in bad weather, so I didn't think much of it at first. But then I saw it just for a second, a shadow moving through the rain. I leaned closer to the monitor, squinting at the screen. The figure was gone now, just an empty rain-soaked courtyard. I told myself it was probably a trick of the light, Maybe some debris blown by the wind. But something about the way the shadow had moved, slow, deliberate, made me uneasy. Grabbing my flashlight and radio, I decided to check it out. The place had a creepy vibe, sure, but I wasn't about to let my imagination get the best of me. I threw on my rain jacket and headed out into the storm. The rain was relentless, soaking me within seconds as I made my way across the crumbling pavement toward the north building. The wind howled, rattling loose metal sheets and sending eerie echoes through the complex. I shone my flashlight ahead, its beam cutting through the dark, but all I could see were the same old decaying structures I'd been staring at for hours. When I reached the north building, I paused at the entrance. The door was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. My heart skipped a beat. I was sure I'd seen that door closed when I'd done my initial rounds, earlier. My hand tightened around the flashlight as I pushed the door open, stepping into the dark, musty interior. Inside, the place was even more rundown than I'd expected. The air was damp and heavy, smelling of mold and rust. Old machinery sat rusting in the corners and water dripped from the ceiling, forming puddles on the cracked concrete floor. I swept my flashlight around the room, but everything seemed still, except for the footprints. I stopped cold when I saw them. Wet footprints leading from the doorway deeper into the building. They were fresh, clear in the puddles of water that had collected on the floor. My mouth went dry. Someone was in here. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound authoritative, though my voice wavered slightly. "This is private property. You're not supposed to be here." No response. Just the sound of water dripping and the distant rumble of thunder. I followed the footprints, moving cautiously, my flashlight beam shaking slightly in my hand. They led down a long, narrow hallway lined with rusted lockers and shattered windows. The air felt colder the further I went, and my breath started to fog in front of me. The prints stopped in front of a heavy metal door at the end of the hall, one that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I hesitated for a moment, listening. Nothing but silence. Gathering my courage, I grabbed the door's rusted handle and pulled. It groaned in protest, but finally gave way, swinging open with a loud creak that echoed through the empty halls. I stepped into the room, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. It was some sort of old storage room, filled with rusting shelves and forgotten equipment. But what caught my attention was the figure standing in the far corner. At first, I thought it was a mannequin, left behind by whoever used to work here. But as my flashlight beam landed on it, I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach that it wasn't. The figure was standing perfectly still, its back to me, wearing what looked like an old, tattered security guard uniform. The fabric was soaked, clinging to its thin frame, and its head was tilted down as if staring at something on the floor. I swallowed hard. "Hey, you're not supposed to be here." The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I kept it trained on the figure. "Are you okay? You need to leave." Still no response, just the steady sound of rain against the roof. My heart pounded in my chest as I inched closer, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The figure wasn't standing on the ground. Its feet hovered just above the floor, barely an inch, but enough to send a jolt of terror through me. Before I could react, the figure's head jerked upward with an unnatural speed, twisting around to face me. Its face, if you could call it that, was a grotesque mask of smooth, pale skin stretched tight over a featureless skull. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank, empty stare. And then it began to move toward me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The thing glided forward, its feet never touching the ground, moving faster and faster as it closed the distance between us. I turned and bolted down the hallway, the sound of its pursuit echoing in the narrow space behind me. I ran as fast as I could, my footsteps splashing through the puddles as I raced back toward the entrance. The rain outside was deafening, but I could still hear it, the soft whispering sound of the figure moving closer. I didn't dare look back. I burst through the door into the storm, slipping on the wet pavement as I scrambled to my feet and ran for the security office. My hand fumbled with the keys, adrenaline surging through me as I finally managed to unlock the door and slam it shut behind me. Panting, soaked to the bone, I locked the door and backed away, staring at the surveillance monitors. My hands were shaking as I scanned the screens, searching for any sign of the figure. But there was nothing, just the empty, rain-soaked complex. I sat down, trying to catch my breath, my eyes darting between the monitors. Everything looked quiet. normal even. Maybe I was losing it, imagining things in the isolation of the night shift. But then, as I glanced at the monitor for the north building, I saw it. The door I had just come through slowly creaked open, and from the darkness, that same figure emerged, floating across the courtyard, moving slowly but steadily toward the security office. And this time, it wasn't alone. I stared at the monitor, my pulse pounding in my ears. Figures were gliding across the rain-soaked courtyard, their movements unnaturally smooth. The grainy camera feed didn't do them justice, but I could still make out the eerie details. Their bodies were drenched, clothes hanging in tatters, faces completely blank like pale, featureless masks. There were more of them now, all drifting toward the security office. I backed up until I hit the wall behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The rain thundered against the thin roof of the office, and the sound of my own heartbeat filled my head. The door was locked, but that felt like a flimsy defense. Whatever these things were, they didn't seem bound by normal rules. I looked around the small room, desperately searching for anything I could use to protect myself. The flashlight was still clutched in my trembling hand, but that wasn't going to help. There was a small cabinet of tools near the desk. I rushed over, flinging it open, hoping for a weapon, but all I found was a rusted crowbar. A loud creak sounded outside the office door. I spun around, my eyes darting to the monitors. The figures were no longer just outside, they were at the door. I could hear the faint, rhythmic tapping of their hands on the metal, as if they were testing the entrance, waiting for the perfect moment to push through. And then it happened. The doorknob began to rattle. I gripped the crowbar, my knuckles white, and backed into the corner of the office. I could barely breathe, the air in the room thick with tension and fear. The rattling stopped, and for a brief, terrible second there was silence. Then the door creaked open. The figures moved into the room, one after another, their feet never touching the ground, their blank, pale faces turned toward me. There were 5 of them now, each wearing the same soaked, torn security uniform. I recognized one of them from the old employee roster photos I had seen earlier. Tommy, the last guard who worked here before the place shut down. Except it wasn't Tommy. It wasn't any of them. These things weren't people anymore. They hovered toward me, their heads tilted slightly, as if curious, as if studying me. The air in the room grew colder, my breath fogging in front of me. I felt a wave of nausea as they closed in, their featureless faces inches from mine. "No!" I shouted, swinging the crowbar wildly. It connected with the closest figure, but there was no resistance, nothing but air. The thing passed right through it, as if it were made of mist. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The figures surrounded me now, pressing closer, their blank faces hovering just above my head. I could hear a faint whispering like distant voices, but I couldn't understand the words. The temperature in the room plummeted, my breath coming out in shallow gasps as ice crept into my veins. And then suddenly, one of them reached out, its cold, thin fingers brushing against my arm. Pain shot through my body, sharp and cold, like ice burning my skin. I cried out, dropping the crowbar as my vision blurred. The world seemed to spin, the figures' faces warping into grotesque shapes as the room tilted and swayed around me. Just as I thought I was about to pass out, everything stopped. The figures froze, their heads snapping toward the door. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. And then, as quickly as they had come, they vanished, dissolving into the cold air like they had never been there at all. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my skin still tingling from where the figure had touched me. For a moment I just lay there, too stunned and too terrified to move. The only sound was the steady pounding of the rain outside. When I finally managed to get to my feet, I staggered to the monitors, my hands shaking. The courtyard was empty now, no figures, no movement, just the rain and the dark abandoned complex. But something told me they weren't gone. Not really. I grabbed my things, not caring about protocol or the fact that my shift wasn't over. I wasn't staying here another second. I practically ran to the door, bursting out into the storm. The cold rain soaked through my clothes instantly, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. As I reached the main gate, I glanced back one last time at the complex. The place loomed in the darkness, its broken windows and rusted metal glistening in the rain. And for a moment, just before I turned away, I thought I saw them. Those figures standing in the shadows near the entrance, watching me, waiting. I left that night and never returned. I quit the job the next day, and when they asked why, I didn't even bother to explain. Who would believe me anyway? But every now and then on stormy nights I think about that place, the abandoned complex, the figures, the cold whispering, and I wonder if they're still there, wandering the empty halls, waiting for someone else to take the night shift. It was a gloomy, rainy night, and I was pulling a late shift at Target. The store had closed hours ago, and the heavy rain drummed against the roof like a never-ending warning. I'd been tasked with restocking some of the shelves and organizing the back room before heading home. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the occasional flicker only reminded me how creepy the store could get when it was empty. As I pushed my cart down the deserted aisles, the place felt too quiet. The shelves stood tall and empty in the dim light, casting long shadows that made me feel like I wasn't entirely alone. The rain outside had intensified, and I could hear the wind howling through the entrance doors. I tried to shake off the uneasiness, telling myself it was just the storm making the store feel more isolated than usual. Around 11:30 p.m., I decided to take a quick break in the employee lounge, hoping the sound of the TV or my phone would distract me from the strange atmosphere. But as I walked toward the back, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. A faint shuffle, like footsteps, coming from the front of the store. I froze. I was supposed to be the only one here. I knew all the doors were locked, and security had already done their rounds. For a moment, I thought it could just be one of the automatic doors malfunctioning in the storm, but I decided to check it out. Grabbing my phone and flashlight, I headed to the front of the store, keeping my ears open for any more sounds. When I reached the front, everything seemed normal. The sliding doors were shut, the rain pelted the windows, and there was no sign of anyone. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange. There were wet footprints on the floor, leading from the entrance toward the clothing section. My stomach dropped. The prints were fresh, small, like a child's, and there was no way they could have been there earlier. I just cleaned this area. I called out, "Hello? Is someone in here?" No answer. Just the sound of rain and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Feeling a chill run down my spine, I followed the footprints cautiously. They wound through the women's section, disappearing into the racks of hanging clothes. I moved the hangers aside, half expecting to find some kid hiding, but there was nothing. Just rows of dresses swaying slightly from the draft. I was about to turn and leave when I saw it. A small shadow darting behind a display near the fitting rooms. My heart raced. Someone was in the store. I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath and followed the shadow, but as I rounded the corner, my flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows across the empty fitting rooms. The smell of damp clothes hung in the air. I swept the flashlight over the stalls. Nothing. Just the mirrors reflecting my own wide-eyed face back at me. The store felt darker now, heavier, like the storm outside had somehow seeped into the building itself. Then, from one of the fitting rooms, I heard a soft, unmistakable giggle. I froze. It was the laugh of a child. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly approached the stall where the sound had come from. My hand shook as I reached for the door, pushing it open. Empty. But then, I noticed something on the floor. A small, red ball. A toy we didn't even sell in the store. My pulse quickened. How did this get here? Suddenly the lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the giggle echoed through the fitting rooms once more, this time louder, closer. My skin crawled as the sound seemed to surround me, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, shining my flashlight down the aisles, but there was no one. The store was empty, or so I thought. I stepped back into the main aisle, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the far end of the store, near the electronics section, was a small figure. It looked like a child, no more than 7 or 8 years old, but something was off. The figure stood completely still, drenched as though it had been out in the rain. The hair hung in wet strands over its face, and its clothes were tattered, dark, and soaked. I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, are you okay? You're not supposed to be in here." The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, facing away from me. I started walking toward it, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty store. But as I got closer, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The figure wasn't standing on the floor. It was hovering just an inch off the ground. My breath caught in my throat, and before I could react, the figure turned around slowly. Its face, if you could call it that, was pale, featureless, just smooth skin where its eyes and mouth should have been. And then it let out that same eerie giggle, louder this time, like it was playing some twisted game. I stumbled back, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the flashlight. The light rolled across the floor, casting wild shadows on the walls. The figure began to move, gliding toward me without a sound, its head tilting unnaturally from side to side as it approached. I ran. I sprinted through the aisles, my shoes squeaking on the wet floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The store felt like a maze now, the shelves closing in around me as I desperately tried to find a way out. Behind me, I could hear the soft padding of footsteps, that eerie giggle following me through the darkness. I burst into the stockroom, slamming the door behind me. My hands fumbled for the key, locking the door with trembling fingers. I stood there, panting, listening. For a moment, all I could hear was the rain and my own frantic breathing. Then, from the other side of the door, there was a single knock, software deliberate. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the door, praying that whatever was out there wouldn't come in. But then, the knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like fists pounding against the door. The walls of the stockroom shook with the force of it, and I knew whatever was out there wanted in. Just as I thought the door would give way, the pounding stopped. Silence. The only sound was the rain outside and the distant hum of the store's generators. I stayed in the stockroom until sunrise, too terrified to move. When the morning shift arrived, I told them everything. But of course, they didn't believe me. They laughed it off, saying I must have been spooked by the storm or just tired from working late. But I know what I saw. And now, every time I work a late shift, I can't help but feel like I'm being watched. Like something is still there, hiding in the shadows of the aisles, waiting for the next stormy night to play its twisted game again. It was my first day on the job as sheriff of a small forgotten town deep in the mountains, far from civilization. The kind of place where the rain never seemed to stop, and the fog rolled in so thick you could barely see past your own outstretched hand. The last sheriff had left without much of a word, just packed up and disappeared. The town council didn't say much either, just a simple welcome, the handover of a worn badge, and a mumbled warning to stay alert. That first night, it was pouring, the kind of rain that seemed to drown out all other sounds, turning the world into a distant, muffled hum. The station was small and old, barely more than a couple of rooms with a flickering light overhead, and a rusty radiator that made strange noises when it struggled to heat the place. I was alone, of course. There wasn't much of a police force in this forgotten corner of the world. Just me. Around 2 a.m., the power went out. Typical, I thought. Just a faulty wire or the old generator giving up after who knows how many years of neglect. I fumbled around with a flashlight, feeling that strange silence that always follows a blackout in places like this. No humming, no crackling radio, no comforting buzz of electricity. Just the rain, hammering down relentlessly outside. I thought about going home for the night. The shift had been uneventful, and I didn't expect much more to happen. But something kept me there. Maybe it was the eerie atmosphere, or maybe it was just the new job jitters. Either way, I stayed, sitting in the dark, staring out the window into the night. And that's when I saw it. A figure standing across the street, barely visible through the rain and fog. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by a tree or something. But as I squinted, I could make out more details. A person, standing completely still, just staring at the station. I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding a little harder than I wanted to admit. I shone the beam out the window, but by the time the light hit the spot where the figure had been standing, it was gone. Just like that. Vanished into the rain. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a local just curious about the new sheriff in town. But there was something off about the way that figure had stood there. Motionless, almost like it wasn't quite human. I went outside to check, the rain immediately soaking through my uniform. The streets were empty, no sign of anyone. Just the sound of water rushing through the gutters and the distant creak of old wooden buildings shifting in the storm. When I got back inside, I noticed something I hadn't before. On my desk, the phone's red message light was blinking. Strange. I hadn't heard it ring. I pressed play. The message was short, just static at first, but then a faint voice broke through. It was hard to make out, distorted, but I could swear it said, "He's coming back." I played it again, but the message was garbled now, incomprehensible. The rain outside seemed louder, as if the storm had picked up. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. I checked the call log, no number, just unknown. I tried to shake it off, but the words kept echoing in my head. "He's coming back." I spent the next few hours pacing the station, trying to convince myself it was just a prank. But deep down, I felt a growing unease. There was something strange about this place, something that the last sheriff hadn't warned me about. And as the night dragged on, I realized why. Around 4 a.m., just before dawn, I heard it. A slow, deliberate knock on the station's front door. I froze. There was no reason for anyone to be out at this hour, especially in this weather. My heart raced as I moved toward the door, flashlight trembling in my hand. The knocking came again, this time louder, more insistent. I stood there, staring at the door, my mind racing. Should I open it? Call for backup? But there was no one to call, no one nearby for miles. It was just me. I stood there, frozen, staring at the muddy footprints that led right up to the station door and disappeared without a trace. My mind raced with questions. Who had been there? How had they vanished into thin air? The rain, heavy and relentless, had already begun to wash away the tracks, but the chill in the air clung to me, heavier than before. My breath came in shallow, shaky bursts, and every instinct told me to lock the door and wait out the night. But something wasn't right. I knew I should call it in, maybe check with the few folks who lived nearby, see if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. But deep down, I knew there was no one out there, no one to help. This wasn't the kind of place where people came out after dark, especially not on nights like this, and especially not with whatever was happening. The rain showed no signs of stopping, but the storm wasn't what worried me. The station felt suffocating now, like the walls were closing in and every shadow seemed to flicker with movement. I slammed the door shut, locking it, and hurried back to my desk. The message light was still blinking, the red dot flashing like a heartbeat in the dark. I pressed play again, hoping to hear more of that voice. Maybe I missed something, some clue, some explanation, but all I got was the same distorted static. Only this time, the voice was different. Not the faint whisper from before. This time it was clearer, deeper. "Don't go outside," it said. "He's already here." I dropped the phone, heart hammering against my chest. The voice didn't sound human. There was a rawness to it, something animalistic, like it was fighting to push the words out. I grabbed the flashlight again, this time checking every room in the station. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore, that something, or someone, was watching me. The station had no windows in the back rooms, just dim, claustrophobic spaces that smelled of old paper and mildew. The flickering light overhead buzzed in and out, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, just like the knocking before. But they weren't coming from outside. They were coming from inside the station. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hand as the steps drew closer. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound authoritative, but my voice wavered. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I inched toward the source of the noise, the hallway that led to the old holding cells. The doors there hadn't been opened in years. This town didn't see much crime, at least not the kind you could lock up, but tonight the air was thick with something worse. As I approached, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The door to the last cell was ajar, just slightly. It hadn't been before. I nudged it open with the flashlight, the door creaking on its hinges. The cell was empty. Just a small, cramped space with a rusted cot and a single window high up on the wall, barred and too small for anyone to crawl through. But something caught my eye. Scratches on the wall, deep grooves carved into the stone like someone had clawed at it. Above the cot, a single word had been etched into the wall in jagged letters. Leave. I stepped back, heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps had stopped, but the sense of being watched had not. I turned to leave the cell, but that's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the doorway. It wasn't like the one I'd seen outside earlier. This one was tall, unnaturally so, its body hunched and twisted in the dim light. Its face was obscured by shadow, but but I could see its eyes, glowing faintly, locked on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I backed away, my hands trembling as I raised the flashlight toward it. But the beam barely penetrated the darkness surrounding the figure. It took a slow step forward, the floor creaking under its weight. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rain pounding on the roof. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it moved closer, its breathing heavy and uneven, like it had been waiting for this moment. Instinct took over. I bolted for the front of the station, my footsteps echoing down the hall. The thing followed, its slow, deliberate steps never quickening but always close behind. I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive, as I reached the main room. Just as I grabbed the door, the power surged back on. The overhead lights flickered to life, casting harsh light across the station. I spun around, expecting to see the figure right behind me, but it was gone. The hallway was empty. For a moment I stood there, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The station was silent again, except for the steady hum of the electricity. The only sound was the rain, still beating against the windows. And then the phone rang. The sharp trill cut through the air, sending a jolt of fear through me. I stared at it, knowing I shouldn't answer, but something made me pick it up. "Hello?" My voice was barely a whisper. There was no static this time, just the sound of breathing on the other end, and then the same voice from before, only clearer now, unmistakable. "He's inside." I dropped the phone, backing away from the desk as a shadow moved in the corner of the room. My breath hitched, eyes darting toward the door. I wasn't going to wait for whatever it was to catch up. I ran out into the rain, not caring that I had no plan, no idea where to go. I just needed to get away, far from that place. As I sprinted into the darkness, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and steady, following me into the night. Whatever it wasn't done with me. And in that moment, I knew the truth. I had stepped into something far beyond my understanding, something old and patient. I had taken the job in a place forgotten by time and by people. But the things that lurked here, in the shadows of the storm and fog, they hadn't forgotten me, and they weren't letting me leave. I was working the night shift as a janitor at St. Vincent's, the old hospital at the edge of town. The place had been around for over a century, mostly abandoned now, except for a few sections still used for storage. It was a rainy night, the kind where the downpour drowns out every other sound, making the world outside feel distant and muffled. It wasn't my first night alone there, but something about that night felt off. The power flickered as soon as I stepped inside, the old fluorescent lights buzzing erratically before coming back on. I grabbed my mop and headed down the long, empty corridor toward the surgical wing. It was one of the oldest parts of the hospital, where they used to perform surgeries back in the early 1900s. The place had a weird history, patients disappearing, strange deaths, the usual urban legends, but it never bothered me before. The smell of mildew hung in the air as I pushed the squeaky cart along. The rain outside pounded against the windows, casting shadows that danced along the walls. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I passed an old operating room, I swear I heard something, a faint shuffle like footsteps. I stopped, listening. Silence, just the rain. I shook it off and kept working, moving to the next room. That's when I noticed it. The operating table in the middle of the room was covered in dust, untouched for decades. But now there were fresh footprints leading up to it, bare footprints, as if someone had walked through the dust just moments ago. My heart started racing. There was no one else here. I knew that for a fact. I had locked the doors behind me and security wasn't due to make rounds until morning. I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, I heard it again. This time, it was clearer. Soft, dragging footsteps coming from the hallway. Slowly, deliberately, they grew closer. I froze, gripping the mop handle tightly. The lights flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the floor. I peeked out into the hallway, and that's when I saw her. At first it was just a dark figure at the far end, barely visible in the dim light. But as she got closer, I could see her more clearly. She was wearing an old hospital gown, pale and thin, her hair wet and stringy as if she had just stepped out of the rain. Her face was obscured, but her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she was searching for something or someone. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a patient. Maybe someone had gotten in without me knowing, but deep down I knew that wasn't possible. She was getting closer. I bolted. Sprinting down the corridor, I didn't stop until I reached the janitor's closet. I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing hard. The rain was still beating against the windows, louder now, almost deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my chest. Then the footsteps, slow and shuffling, just outside the door. I held my breath. The handle rattled softly, as if something, was trying to open it. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a soft scratching sound, like nails dragging across the wood. I don't know how long I stayed in there, clutching the mop like it could protect me. Minutes, hours. But eventually the noises stopped, and the only sound left was the rain. I waited until I was sure it was gone. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty. No footprints, no shadowy figures, nothing. Just the flickering lights and the distant sound of rain. I didn't finish the shift that night. I grabbed my stuff and got out of there as fast as I could. I never went back to St. Vincent's after that. And to this day, I can't help but wonder who or what was wandering those halls, looking for someone to join them in the darkness. It was a cold, rainy night deep in the wilderness. The fire station where I was stationed was far from civilization, a small outpost nestled at the edge of a dense forest. We called it the last stop, and it felt fitting, as nothing but miles of trees and mountains lay beyond. On most nights, it was a peaceful kind of solitude, but tonight was different. I was alone on the night shift, my partner having taken leave for the week. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, heavy drops pattering against the station's tin roof, creating a dull, almost hypnotic rhythm. The lights flickered every so often, struggling to stay alive against the storm's fury. I busied myself with routine tasks, checking equipment, cleaning the truck. But that eerie stillness of being alone in such isolation always gnawed at me. It felt like the station itself was breathing in sync with the storm. Around midnight, the radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. It was faint at first, just static, but then a voice came through, distant and distorted. "Station 42, come in." I picked up the receiver. "This is Station 42. Go ahead." Nothing. Just static again. I adjusted the frequency, trying to clear the signal. It could have been interference from the storm, but something about the transmission unsettled me. Then the voice returned, clearer this time. "Fire, near Blackwood Point." Blackwood Point was at least 20 miles into the forest, deep and rarely visited. A fire out there, in this downpour? It didn't make sense. Still, protocol was protocol. I suited up, grabbed my gear, and headed for the truck. The rain was relentless, slamming against the windshield as I drove along the narrow, muddy road toward Blackwood Point. The headlights struggled to cut through the sheets of rain, illuminating nothing but trees and the occasional flicker of lightning in the distance. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the coordinates near Blackwood Point. There was no fire, not even smoke. I stepped out of the truck, rain drenching me instantly. The silence was deafening except for the sound of raindrops hitting the leaves. I shone my flashlight around, scanning the area. Nothing. Just the oppressive darkness of the forest. I was about to radio back when I saw something in the distance, a faint, flickering light deep in the woods just beyond the tree line. It wasn't a fire, more like a lantern swaying gently in the wind. I hesitated, but my training kicked in. Maybe someone was out here, lost or hurt. I grabbed my flashlight and started toward the light. As I got closer, the light vanished. I stopped, heart pounding in my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something wasn't right. I swept my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the rain-soaked trees. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure barely visible darting between the trees. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I took a few steps forward, my boots squelching in the mud. The figure reappeared, closer now, but still obscured by the shadows. It was a person, I was sure of it, but they didn't respond. I called out again, louder this time. Nothing but the sound of the rain. Suddenly, the radio on my belt crackled again, making me jump. "Station 42, come in," the same voice from earlier, but this time it sounded wrong, distorted, almost inhuman. I grabbed the radio. "This is Station 42, what's your situation?" Silence. Then the voice again, low and garbled. "Look behind you." I froze. My blood turned to ice. Slowly I turned around, the beam of my flashlight trembling as it cut through the darkness. There, standing just a few feet away, was the figure. It was a man, or at least it used to be. His clothes were tattered, soaked through from the rain, and his skin was pale, almost gray. But it was his eyes that chilled me to the core. They were wide, unblinking, and hollow. He wasn't alive. He couldn't be. Before I could react, the figure lunged toward me. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight in the mud, my heart hammering in my chest. I scrambled to my feet and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches slashing at my face as I sprinted back toward the truck. Behind me, I could hear the wet, heavy footsteps of the figure gaining on me. I reached the truck, fumbling with the door, finally wrenching it open and diving inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure stood just outside the driver's side window, staring at me, those hollow eyes piercing through the glass. Then, without a sound, he disappeared into the darkness. I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the narrow, winding road back to the station. When I finally made it back, I radioed in the incident, but no one could explain what had happened. No fire was ever reported at Blackwood Point, and no one was supposed to be out there. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. But I'll never forget those hollow eyes and the way the rain seemed to fall harder, as if the storm itself was warning me to stay away from Blackwood Point. The metal roof of the warehouse, a constant drumming that seemed to grow louder the longer I worked. I was the only one on the night shift that evening, surrounded by tall, looming shelves filled with crates, boxes, and pallets. The echo of my footsteps bounced off the concrete floor, and the occasional flicker of the old fluorescent lights overhead added to the eerie atmosphere. I'd been working late to finish organizing a shipment, moving boxes from one section to another, when I heard something strange, a faint shuffling sound coming from the far end of the warehouse. I paused, holding my breath for a moment, but the sound had stopped. Maybe it was just the rain, or maybe the wind slipping through one of the old vents. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't completely alone. I grabbed my clipboard and went back to work, trying to distract myself by focusing on the tasks at hand. The rows of shelves were like a labyrinth, with narrow aisles that made it easy to feel hemmed in. The dim, flickering lights only made it worse. As I made my way down one of the aisles, I heard the sound again, a soft thud, like something heavy being dropped. I stopped in my tracks and strained to listen. The warehouse was huge, and sounds tended to echo in strange ways, but this felt too close, too real. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering slightly, though I tried to sound casual. No answer. Taking a deep breath, I headed toward the back of the warehouse where the sound seemed to come from. The rain continued to pour outside, and the wind was picking up, making the entire building creak and groan. As I approached one of the far corners of the warehouse, I noticed something odd. One of the crates was open. That was impossible. I hadn't opened any crates tonight, and I was the only one with the key to the storage locks. My heart started to race as I walked closer, shining my flashlight into the crate. It was empty, except for a damp footprint on the inside of the lid. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and this time, they went out entirely. The warehouse plunged into darkness, the only light coming from my small flashlight, casting long, shifting shadows across the shelves. I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. I reached for my phone to call for help, but of course there was no signal. The storm must have knocked out the reception. My breathing was shallow now, the air in the warehouse suddenly feeling thick and suffocating. I decided to head back to the office area, where I could at least lock the door and wait until the power came back. As I made my way through the maze of shelves, I heard it again. Another thud, followed by the distinct sound of something dragging across the floor. My flashlight beam shook in my hand as I swung it toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just more shelves, more boxes. But the dragging sound persisted, like something or someone was moving just out of sight. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing faster now, but no matter how fast I walked, the sound seemed to follow me, growing closer, like it was stalking me through the aisles. My chest tightened with panic, and every instinct was telling me to run. Then, I saw it. At the far end of the aisle, barely illuminated by my flashlight, was a figure. At first, I thought it was one of the mannequins we stored in the back for shipping, but it was moving, slowly, unnaturally. The figure was hunched, its limbs elongated, and its head hung low as it dragged something heavy behind it. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure stopped, then slowly turned its head toward me. Even in the dim light, I could tell something was terribly wrong. Its face was blank, just pale, featureless skin stretched over its skull, with no eyes, no mouth. The thing began to move toward me, faster now, its feet scraping across the floor. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the sound of the rain, and I bolted. I didn't care where I was running, I just needed to get away. I could hear it behind me, its dragging footsteps getting louder, closer. I stumbled into the office, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked it, backing away from the door. The small office felt claustrophobic, but at least it was a barrier between me and whatever that thing was. For a moment, everything was silent except for the sound of the rain. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the blood rushing in my ears. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, slow and deliberate. It knew I was in here. I backed away, pressing myself against the far wall, clutching the flashlight in my trembling hand. The tapping grew louder, and then, as if mocking me, I heard it again. That dragging sound, and this time, it whispered my name. The dragging sound outside the office door sent a fresh wave of terror through me. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do next. The rain continued to hammer down on the roof, muffling the distant world outside, while amplifying every eerie noise inside. The rhythmic tapping on the door was driving me to the edge of panic, each knock deliberate, as if whatever was out there knew exactly what it was doing. I scanned the small office, looking for anything I could use to defend myself. A metal chair, a paperweight, anything. But I knew deep down that if that thing got in here, I wasn't going to be able to stop it with a chair. I needed to get out. My eyes fell on the small window at the back of the office. It was barely big enough to squeeze through, but in that moment, I didn't care. It was my only chance. Slowly, I crept toward the window, trying not to make a sound. The tapping stopped. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The silence was worse, far worse. I stood there, not daring to move, straining to hear anything beyond the pounding of the rain. And then, the door handle rattled. I watched in horror as it slowly began to turn. The door creaked open just an inch, revealing a sliver of darkness from the warehouse beyond. My heart hammered in my chest as I instinctively backed away, my eyes fixed on the gap in the door. For a moment, nothing happened. The gap stayed still, taunting me with its silence. Then, from that narrow opening, I saw it. Those long, pale fingers, curling around the edge of the door, pulling it open inch by inch. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but somehow I managed to move, lunging for the window. I fumbled with the latch, trying desperately to open it as quietly as possible. The door behind me creaked wider, and I could hear the dragging sound again. This time softer, as if the thing was being cautious, as if it knew I had nowhere to run. Finally, the window gave way, and I pushed it open. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the sound of the storm outside. Without thinking, I hoisted myself up, squeezing through the narrow frame. Just as I began to pull myself out, I felt something cold brush against my ankle. I screamed and kicked, thrashing to free myself, and for a moment I thought I felt those cold fingers wrap around my leg. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. With one last frantic push, I tumbled out of the window and landed hard on the wet pavement outside, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Gasping for breath, I scrambled to my feet, glancing back at the window. It was empty. No sign of the figure, no hand reaching after me. But the office door was now wide open, and I could see into the darkened warehouse beyond. Shadows moved within the aisles, and for just a second, I thought I saw the faceless figure standing there, motionless, watching me. I didn't wait to find out. I took off into the rain, sprinting through the alleyway behind the warehouse, my footsteps splashing through puddles as I ran. The rain soaked through my clothes, chilling me to the bone, but I didn't care. I just kept running, not daring to look back. When I finally made it to the main road, I slowed down, gasping for breath. The street was empty, the rain still pouring down in heavy sheets, but the familiar sight of streetlights and parked cars was a welcome relief. I fumbled for my phone, hoping the storm hadn't completely knocked out the signal, and to my relief, I saw a single bar of service. I called the police, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. I knew how it sounded. I barely believed it myself, but I couldn't go back there, not tonight, not ever. By the time the police arrived, the rain had let up, leaving the streets slick and quiet. They searched the warehouse but found no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone or anything had been inside. The open crate in the back was still there, but the footprint was gone and the office door was locked again, as if I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. The police chalked it up to nerves, maybe stress from working too many late nights alone. But as I stood there staring at the warehouse in the dim morning light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in there, lurking among the crates and shelves, waiting for the next person to stay behind after dark. And as I turned to leave, I swore I heard it again. That soft, dragging sound, echoing from deep within the shadows of the warehouse. I've worked the night shift as a delivery man for years, but there was one night, a stormy, pitch-black night that I'll never forget. It was a Friday, the kind of night where most people are home, cozy and warm, waiting for their takeout orders. But the rain was relentless, coming down in thick sheets, flooding the streets. Deliveries were sparse that night, probably because no one wanted to venture out in the storm. I thought I'd have an easy shift, but that changed when the last order came through. It was an odd one. The address was way out on the edge of town, in a rural area I wasn't familiar with. I didn't think much of it at first, just another order, another tip. But as I drove, the rain got worse and the GPS kept glitching. It was leading me down narrow, winding roads that barely looked like they were used anymore. No streetlights, just darkness and rain. Finally, I reached the location. It was an old, run-down house, almost hidden by overgrown trees. The windows were dark, no lights inside, no sign of life. My headlights barely cut through the downpour, but I could see the house looked abandoned. The kind of place that had been forgotten by time. I checked the order again, double-checking the address. Yep, this was it. My gut told me to leave, but I've been in this job long enough to know that sometimes people live in the most unexpected places. I grabbed the bag of food, pulled up my hood, and ran through the rain to the front door. The porch creaked under my feet as I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out, "Delivery!" My voice sounded strange against the constant hiss of the rain. Still nothing. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard it. A soft creak from inside the house, like someone slowly opening a door. I knocked one more time, and the front door, it just slowly swung open by itself. I froze. The inside of the house was pitch black. No lights, no sounds. Just the rain outside and the open door in front of me. I peered inside, trying to make out anything, but it was just darkness. "Hello? I have your delivery," I called out, my voice shaking a bit. No response. I stood there, unsure of what to do. Protocol said I should leave the food at the door if no one was home. But something about this felt wrong, very wrong. I set the bag down carefully on the doorstep, but as I did, I heard something. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from inside the house. I stood up, heart racing, staring into the blackness. The footsteps stopped. I was just about to walk away when a voice, barely a whisper, came from inside the house. "Come inside." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was barely audible over the rain, but I knew I heard it. I stepped back instinctively, my pulse quickening. The door creaked wider, revealing more of the dark, empty interior. I couldn't see anyone inside, but the voice, it was like it came from everywhere at once. "Come. Inside." I turned around, ready to get the hell out of there. But as I reached my car, I heard the sound again, this time louder, more insistent. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was like someone, or something, was calling me. I fumbled with my keys, trying to get the door open, when I heard a loud bang, like something heavy had slammed against the front door of the house. My heart nearly stopped. I glanced back just in time to see the front door shut, but not before I caught a glimpse of something. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the doorway watching me. I didn't stick around to see more. I jumped into my car, locking the doors and gunning the engine. My tires spun on the wet gravel as I sped away, rain blurring the windshield. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone, or something, following me. But there was nothing. Just rain and darkness. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city, the streetlights and buildings bringing a sense of normalcy back. When I finally pulled over to catch my breath, I checked my phone. The app had already marked the delivery as completed, but there was no tip, no feedback. It was as if the order never existed. The next day, I tried to look up the address again. Just out of curiosity, I wanted to see if there was some explanation. Maybe it was a prank, or I had the wrong place. But when I entered the location into the GPS, it didn't exist. The road I had driven down wasn't even on the map. I told myself I must have been tired. Maybe the rain had played tricks on my mind. But every now and then, I think about that night. About the voice that called me inside. About the figure I saw standing in the doorway. And sometimes when I'm out on late-night deliveries, driving through dark, empty streets, I hear it again. That whisper.